I gotta address this. I haven't talked about Lula da Silva on this show for a little while, but I will continue to cover it on this show, and of course, we cover it a lot on TMBS. But let me just reset a little bit why this matters so much. And obviously, some of it's personal to me. I think that this is an incredibly admirable and important leader in the 21st century, and the treatment of him is abysmal and terrifying and a moral scar on the world. But broadening out from that, let's look at a couple of variables in play, because it goes to several dynamics that we need to understand, and I'll give you the new news in a second. One is the ongoing interference of the United States in Latin America, which we're seeing come to a head in this intervention and pressure in Venezuela. Going back, of course, we all know the history. We know going back to Eisenhower backing coups in Guatemala. We know that Nixon backed a coup that got rid of Allende in Chile. We've known that at least 48, if not more, coups have been backed by the United States in Latin America, as well as supporting, in the Condor years in the 70s and 80s, coordinated death squads across the region backed by the United States, and the CIA involvement in the juntas and mass murders in Central America under Reagan in the 80s, through Panama with Bush, and then in the 90s into the aughts, which is what the pink wave came out of, was a paradox where certainly under Clinton and Bush II, well, there was definitely attempted coups with Bush II, and there certainly was a massive strong-arming of Latin American and Caribbean economies. The Clinton administration's policies on cotton, as an example, did enormous damage to Haiti. And you also had a sort of a slight stasis where at least center-left governments could come into power, and if they played by what was then consensus on market rules, they could use some of the excess of a commodities boom to invest in their people. And then there was another contingent, as exemplified by Chavez, who took a more aggressive posture, and then people like Rafael Correa in Ecuador, who were in the middle. But they all backed each other, and they all had a shared commitment to autonomy and independence for Latin America, and one that was not adversarial to the United States or Europe. It wasn't adversarial to anybody. President Lula was equally at home and praised by George W. Bush, Tony Blair, and Barack Obama as he was by leaders in the Middle East and Africa, as well as being widely admired across Latin America. So, and this leads to the second two parts here. One, again, this presidency is unparalleled in terms of the 21st century. The historian Perry Anderson said he probably is the most successful president of this century. That's important. It's important on a progressive show, and if you want to be in a progressive movement, when any leader lifts between 30 and 40 million people out of abject poverty, when anybody eliminates hunger in a country. The UN had said there was a serious hunger problem in Brazil. After Lula is president, because of serious investment, there's no longer hunger in Brazil. And then you look at, even as an example, his attempts to forge a deal with Iran on their nuclear weapons, or excuse me, not their weapons, their nuclear program was a forerunner to what ended up being negotiated. So this is an incredibly successful president. This is also a guy who grew up homeless and was a labor union leader who helped liberate Brazil from a military dictatorship in the 1980s. So he also, just by his very identity, in fact, represented a rebuke of Brazil's elite and ended up leaving office with a mid-80s approval rating. And this is where the backlash and the component of U.S. foreign policy comes in, which is starting with the Clinton State Department, the Obama administration, okaying a coup against Manuel Zelaya in Honduras in 2009. Manuel Zelaya was on the Lula end of the pink tide, a moderate center-left leader in Honduras who started working with the social movements and started understanding the need for social investment. In fact, when he was run out by the military, Lula hosted him, they provided him refuge in the Brazilian embassy at the time. And while, the dynamic with Venezuela was different, and there was a hugely aggressive approach towards Venezuela from Bush and Obama. And the Venezuelan government achieved many great things under Chavez, but they also had problems, as well as any government is. Lula played by these rules and managed to create autonomy and lift people out of poverty. But ultimately, it came to a head with an unwillingness to privatize key strategic Brazilian industries, like their oil reserves, which plays a huge role in the shifting U.S. posture towards him and the Workers' Party and the Dilma administration that came after him. And then the backlash from the Brazilian elites. And so by this time, starting in, like, say, 2012 and so, you have, like, along with these broad, sprawling corruption investigations that only focus on center-left to left leaders backed by the United States, which what they call lawfare in Brazil, the process that targeted Lula. You also have the new version of old CIA propaganda, which is things like the Atlas Network, which is funded by the Koch brothers, operating in Brazil and in Venezuela and elsewhere to disseminate libertarian propaganda and support far-right reactionary forces in Latin America. In 2016, there was a judicial process that removed Dilma Rousseff from power. It was a coup, and it's broadly acknowledged as such now. And then, of course, last summer, we saw Lula, in spite of all of this, leading by double digits in the polls. He was put in prison literally for indeterminate acts. That was the phrase they used. Sergio Moro, the special prosecutor who was backed by the Justice Department here, essentially acknowledged that he had no material evidence to jail Lula, but just knew, he felt it in his gut that something was wrong. So out of this multi-billion-dollar corruption investigation that implicated all major parties in Brazil, because there's structural corruption in Brazil, which we can get to some other time, which implicates the whole political system, certainly not just the Workers' Party. One seaside condo, which Lula didn't even own, and they couldn't even prove that he literally even physically spent time in, he was put in jail for 12 years, barred for running for president in contradiction of all international law, and not allowed to do public interviews, totally silenced. Bolsonaro's been in power now for a couple of months. He was backed by Wall Street, backed by Trump, backed by Trudeau, and so on. And there are now actual corruption investigations emerging around Bolsonaro, like connections between his family and a paramilitary gang that assassinated Marielle Franco. Besides all of which, all of the overt corruption taking place, like the destruction of the Amazon. And they have just taken this opportunity to slap Lula with another 12-year sentence for, I kid you not, kitchen renovations on a friend's house. Again, no proof that he even owned the thing, and also all of this took place post-presidency. So, again, you want to take a global phenomenon? Maybe Barack Obama shouldn't go on vacation with Richard Branson after he's president. But he's not going to go to jail for it, and nor should he. This is shocking. This is also, by the way, a couple weeks ago, they did an exorcism around Lula's office. These are crazy, demented, dangerous people who've criminalized the most important president in Brazil and, by extension, Latin America's history, and now we're attempting to erase him from the public record in entirety. Judge Sergio Moro, the judge that hounded and persecuted Lula, is now, of course, justice minister in this fascistic, corrupt Brazilian government. And I will just say, as an example, in this new ludicrous ruling, I'll quote briefly now from Brian Meir in Brazil Wire. Basically, again, there was no evidence that Lula owned the home. The judge who sentenced him was not even in the jurisdiction where the supposed crime took place. As in the case, this is quoting now briefly, as in the case of the Guara Uja beachfront apartment used to arrest Lula at the outset of the 2018 election season when he was leading the polls, investigators were unable to prove that Lula owns the property in question. In this case, the property is legally registered to the name Fernando Bittar. Bittar is a businessman and son of one of Lula's oldest friends, Jaco Bittar, who's a former union leader and ex-mayor of Campinas, which is a population of 1 million and is the 11th richest city in Brazil. Goes on to explain that, again, this was in a different judicial system. And the other thing that's just kind of funny in this case is that the judge in their ruling, she made a lot of technical mistakes, including listing employees and co-defendants in the case as two different people when they actually referred to one different entity. Like literally a company name was listed as two different people in the case. So look, we can get it, dig into more of the details if you want to. I would suggest reading everything in Brazil Wire, but that is the big picture context we're in. And in an even bigger picture, all of these fascist governments, whether it's drain the swamp, whether it's bar the most popular politician and important politician in the country running for president so you can facilitate fascism, whether it's the mafia investigations that lead to Berlusconi in Italy, it's all a shallow demagogic anti-corruption politics that leads to the far right. So people are going to need to get much smarter about how we talk about corruption, what that actually means, and specifically what we're actually targeting. Because right now, generic anti-corruption discourse is the handmaiden of global fascism. And I will continue to say, they're trying to make it so this man, he cannot even go see his family. He's in solitary confinement. They want him to die in prison. And there are many other examples, which I don't have time to get into, but ways in which they're even just ignoring Brazilian legal precedent to do this. It's inhumane. It's disgusting. And all of us, certainly with any platform or any access to anything, need to speak on it. And more people. Bernie spoke about it in the spring. And Barbara Lee and Ro Khanna and Keith Ellison and other good Congress people signed a letter, but there needs to be a hell of a lot more done on this. And please do not ever send me some trash New York Times article telling me that, there was another corruption investigation. If you believe these cases, you're essentially believing, if Whitaker and Jeff Sessions had unlimited power to prosecute Barack Obama and he was in jail while Trump was president, but also he could run for a third term but was barred for running. That's essentially what you're doing. Okay.